The first clash. They thought a black woman in a robe couldn't shake the ground they stood on. They were about to find out how wrong they were. The first time I saw Captain Roy Halston, he was leaning back in the witness chair like he owned it. One arm draped over the backrest, the other resting on his thigh, his eyes scanning the courtroom as if he were the one presiding. The only time his gaze landed on me, it wasn't respect I saw, it was appraisal. Calculated. Cold. The kind of look that measured not your mind, but the boxes you checked: race, gender, age. In his mind, I had already failed the test. It was my second week on the bench, and the case was supposed to be straightforward on paper. A young man, barely 20, had filed a complaint against 2 officers for excessive force during a traffic stop. His injuries were documented, his testimony consistent, and the dashcam footage, though conveniently missing 15 seconds, was damning enough to raise serious questions. Captain Halston wasn't even directly involved in the incident, but he'd inserted himself into the proceedings, calling press conferences, feeding the media with statements about soft judges and anti-police bias. And now here he was, ready to make a spectacle of himself in my courtroom. I leaned forward slightly, my hands clasped on the bench. "Captain Halston," I began, my voice measured, "please answer the question from the prosecution." He smirked, leaning into the microphone. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I've been a police officer for 25 years. I know when a case is built on nothing but emotion." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. I could feel the heat rising in the room, not from me, but from the young man's mother sitting in the second row, her hands trembling in her lap. I kept my tone steady. "Captain, the law does not weigh emotion against evidence. In this courtroom, we weigh facts. So, let's return to the question." He cut me off. "Maybe if the bench had more real-world experience and less social justice ambition, we'd get somewhere." The words hung in the air like a slap. He didn't say black. He didn't have to. I'd been warned about him before I ever wore the robe. "Halston doesn't respect the chain of command unless he's on top of it," a colleague had whispered. "He's not afraid to push boundaries, especially with people he thinks can't push back." But I had pushed back my entire life. From the time I was 9 years old, sitting beside my father in a cramped church basement where he planned voter registration drives, to the day I stood on the steps of the state courthouse with my first law degree in hand, I'd been told the same thing: they will test you. Every time. And you will pass, because you have to. The rest of the hearing played out like a dance with a partner determined to step on your feet. He dodged direct answers, inserted opinion into every response, and smirked at the gallery when he thought I wasn't looking. I could feel the media's cameras drinking it in, another tough cop standing up to the activist judge. When I ruled in favor of allowing the excessive force complaint to proceed to trial, his jaw tightened just enough for me to notice. But he didn't explode, not yet. He saved that for the hallway outside, where reporters swarmed like hornets. "This is exactly what I've been talking about," he told them, loud enough for me to hear as I exited. "We've got people in robes more interested in making headlines than keeping the streets safe. And I'll say it, experience matters, and some folks just don't have it." The crowd ate it up. Cameras flashed. Microphones pushed closer. And though he never said my name, the message was clear: she doesn't belong here. That night, I sat in my office long after the building emptied, the city's skyline glowing through the window. I replayed every word, every smirk, every calculated insult. This wasn't just ego. It was strategy. Halston was setting the stage for something bigger, something that went beyond one case. And if my instincts were right, I was about to walk into the middle of it. They don't just want to win. They want to erase you. By Monday morning, it was everywhere. Every local channel. Every blog that fed on outrage. Clips of Captain Halston outside the courthouse, his jaw set like steel, his voice dripping with performative concern. "Law and order is under attack," he said to one reporter, gesturing vaguely at the courthouse steps. "And when the people in charge of justice have an agenda, the whole system crumbles." The headline banners made it worse. "Captain Halston calls out activist judge. Police captain questions new judge's experience." Not one of them used my name. Not one of them mentioned that I had been a trial attorney for 15 years, had argued before the appellate court, had built my career on cases that most lawyers wouldn't touch. By noon, my clerk brought in a stack of mail and a handful of printed emails. "Some of these are ugly," she said carefully. I flipped through them. The usual. Anonymous notes telling me to go back where I came from. Emails warning me that people like you shouldn't be making decisions for real Americans. A few tried to sound polite, those were the ones I found most dangerous. The letters that framed prejudice as concern and bigotry as advice. I could have ignored it. I could have told myself it was just noise. But I knew better. Halston wasn't just playing to the public. He was rallying allies. In this city, the police captain's favor was currency. And there were plenty of council members, donors, and backroom dealmakers who would spend it gladly. 2 days later, it started. A rumor in the press that I had a conflict of interest in the excessive force case. That my younger brother, who lived in another state, was somehow connected to a local activist group that had protested police violence. It was absurd. It was also deliberate. I saw the fingerprints of a PR machine all over it. And if Halston was willing to fabricate connections, then this was more than personal, it was tactical. He wanted me cornered, discredited, maybe even recused from the case entirely. That night, I called my mentor, Judge Elena Morales. "Don't give him what he wants," she said bluntly. "If you recuse yourself, you give him the win. You give him the headline, 'Judge steps down under scrutiny.'" I didn't respond right away. In my mind, I was back in law school, sitting in her cramped office while she told me the one rule she said mattered above all: they will try to move you off the board. Don't let them. The next morning, I walked into my chambers to find a thin envelope on my desk. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one sentence, cut from a newspaper and glued in place. "We know where you live." I stared at it for a long moment, then set it down. Fear wasn't foreign to me. But this was different. This was the kind of threat meant to make you hesitate, not just in court, but in every step you took. That afternoon, the gallery in my courtroom was packed. Not just with the public, but with uniformed officers off duty, arms crossed, eyes fixed on me. A silent show of solidarity for their captain. Halston sat in the front row, smirking. He didn't need to speak. His presence said everything. "This is my house." But he was wrong. This wasn't his house. It wasn't mine, either. It belonged to the law. And under that law, he didn't outrank me. Not yet. If they're watching you, make sure they see exactly what you want them to. The shift didn't happen overnight. It began with a single meeting, off the record, in a corner booth of a diner 3 blocks from the courthouse. Across from me sat Special Agent Daniel Price, Federal Task Force Liaison. We'd crossed paths years ago when I was still in private practice, both working a corruption case that ended with 3 city officials in prison. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You've got a problem in your house," he said, sipping his coffee. "And from what I'm hearing, it's been rotting there for a while." I kept my voice low. "You're talking about Halston." He gave a slow nod. "Word is, he's not just a bully with a badge. There's money moving through his department that doesn't line up. Contracts, overtime payouts, seized assets, some of it disappearing. I'd suspected as much. Men like Halston didn't thrive on ego alone. They built networks, old friends in procurement, cousins in private security firms, politicians who owed them favors. I can't be seen as part of an investigation, I told Price. If this looks personal, he cut in. We don't need you on the front line. We just need you to keep him talking. Keep him visible. Let him get comfortable thinking he's untouchable. It wasn't hard. Halston loved a camera. And the more he talked, the more he bragged, the more threads began to unravel. I allowed his legal counsel to file motions that gave him space to testify on procedural issues, small victories he thought he was winning. But each time he opened his mouth, my court reporter captured every word. Behind the scenes, I fed scheduling updates to Price's team, making sure they knew exactly when and where Halston would be. They started tailing his second-in-command, monitoring department spending, quietly interviewing officers who transferred out of his unit. Meanwhile, the pressure he was putting on me didn't stop. Anonymous calls to my chambers. A journalist asking about rumors of an ethics complaint against me. A thinly veiled suggestion from a councilman that I consider taking a leave of absence until things cool down. I didn't flinch, but I didn't sleep much either. One morning, I arrived at the courthouse to find the front steps crowded, not with protesters, but with families holding framed photos of sons, daughters, brothers. They weren't here for me. They were here for him. A woman in her 50s stepped forward as I climbed the steps. "I heard what he said about you," she told me. "Don't let him scare you. He's been doing this for years. To all of us." Her voice cracked. My boy's case never even made it to trial. I looked at the photo in her hands. A young man, barely 20, smiling in a cap and gown. "Ma'am," I said quietly, "I can't promise outcomes. But I can promise you this truth has a way of getting in, even when doors are locked." By the end of that week, Price called me again. "We've got a thread," he said. "A bank transfer from a shell account linked to a private security company. That company's on the payroll for your courthouse security upgrades last year." Guess who signed the contract? I didn't have to guess. Halston's signature was as bold and arrogant on paper as he was in person. The pieces were starting to align, and for the first time since this began, I felt the ground shift, not under me, but under him. Still, I knew what was coming. Men like Halston didn't go down quietly, and when he realized the walls were closing in, he would come for me harder than ever. They expect you to play defense. Surprise them by taking the first swing. The morning the trial resumed, the air outside the courthouse felt heavier, as if the city itself was holding its breath. A crowd had gathered, reporters clustered near the steps, cameras poised, microphones extended like bayonets. I could hear the low buzz of their chatter, punctuated by the occasional shout of my name. Inside, the courtroom was already packed. Uniformed officers lined one side of the gallery, their badges catching the fluorescent light. On the other side sat families, community activists, and ordinary citizens who had been watching this slow collision for weeks. At the front, Captain Roy Halston sat beside his attorney, leaning back in his chair with that same smirk that had taunted me from the start. Only now, there was something else in his eyes, a flicker of calculation, the awareness that not everything was under his control anymore. I took my seat on the bench, the gavel cool in my hand. Court is now in session. The prosecution rose first, but it was the defense that made the opening move. "Your Honor," Halston's attorney began, "we'd like to file a motion to dismiss, citing judicial bias." I expected it. They'd been hinting at this for days, trying to paint me as incapable of impartiality because I'd refused to bend to their tactics. "Motion denied," I said, without hesitation. "You may proceed with your witness." The witness was Halston himself. It was a gamble. Putting him on the stand opened him to cross-examination, but it also gave him a platform to perform for the gallery and the press. He didn't waste it. "I've served this city for 25 years, he began, his voice rich with false humility. "I've protected people who didn't even know they were in danger. And now, I'm being dragged through the mud because certain individuals have an agenda." His eyes found mine. "They want to make an example out of me. They want to send a message that no one is safe, not even the men and women who put their lives on the line every day." When it was the prosecution's turn, their questions were precise, deliberate. "Captain Halston, is this your signature on the contract for courthouse security upgrades last year?" "Yes." "Are you aware that the company receiving those funds is owned by your cousin?" A pause. "I was not aware of that at the time." "Are you aware that the funds for that contract came from a seized assets account currently under investigation for missing funds?" Another pause. The smirk faltered. By the time they were done, the performance was over. The gallery was silent, save for the scratch of pens and the click of cameras. I leaned forward, my voice carrying across the room. "Captain Halston, you seem to have forgotten something important. In this courtroom, your badge does not grant you immunity. Your rank does not place you above the law. And under this law," I let the words hang just long enough, "I outrank you." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The press surged forward, lenses flashing. Halston's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing, but he said nothing. Within the hour, I signed an order removing him from active duty pending further investigation. The paper was handed to him right there at the defense table. He didn't look at it, but I saw the truth in his expression. This was the first time in years someone had told him no, and meant it. As the court adjourned, I could hear the whispers, the hurried voices of reporters feeding lines into microphones. For the first time since this began, the story wasn't about an activist judge. It was about a captain who had finally been caught. Justice isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. It's the silence after the gavel falls that tells you it's real. 3 weeks after I signed the order suspending Captain Roy Halston, the headlines had shifted. No longer was it about a feud between a judge and a police captain. The narrative had changed. Now it was about the investigation. About the money trail. About the people who had looked the other way for far too long. Every day brought something new. A leaked memo showing Halston had personally approved questionable overtime payments to a select few officers. Bank records tracing funds from seized assets into accounts tied to his extended family. Emails between him and city contractors, arranging informal agreements over steak dinners and golf weekends. The public outrage was mounting. And for the first time, I saw cracks in the blue wall of silence. One morning, I walked into the courthouse to find a familiar face waiting by the security checkpoint. It was Officer Lena Brooks, a patrol officer who had testified against her own partner in an excessive force case 2 years ago. She had paid for that testimony, in every cold shoulder and every delayed promotion. "Your Honor," she said quietly, glancing around, "I thought you should know, they're talking. A lot of people. About how it's different now. How maybe the law actually works." I nodded, the weight of her words heavier than she could know. "It's working because people like you make it work." The day of the formal hearing on Halston's misconduct, the courtroom was once again full, but this time, there was no smirk on his face. No swagger in his step. He sat stiffly beside his attorney, eyes forward, jaw tight. The state attorney laid out the case in meticulous detail. The contracts. The bank transfers. The missing funds. Piece by piece, the shield he had built for himself was dismantled, not by me, but by the law he had sworn to uphold. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. "Captain Halston, you have spent decades in a position of authority. With that authority came trust that you abused for personal gain. The law is clear, and so is my ruling." I signed the final order in front of him. Effective immediately, Roy Halston was removed from the police force. As I rose from the bench, the room remained silent. Not the silence of apathy, but of something else, something rarer. The silence of people recognizing that, just maybe, the system had worked this time. I knew better than to believe it was over. Corruption doesn't die with one man. It shifts, finds new hosts, new shadows to hide in. But I also knew this: the message had been sent. Loudly. Clearly. No one, not even the man who thought he owned the law, was above it. The storm doesn't pass just because you win in court. Sometimes, that's when the clouds get darker. The day after Halston's removal, I woke to the sound of tires crunching over gravel outside my home. It was still dark. Through the blinds, I caught the faint glint of headlights idling at the edge of my driveway. No one got out. No engine door opened. After a minute, the car backed away, slow, deliberate, disappearing into the pre-dawn quiet. It was the first sign, not loud enough to be a direct threat, but just loud enough to be felt. 2 days later, my assistant brought in my mail with a wary expression. Half of it was fan letters, people thanking me for standing up to corruption, for proving the system isn't broken. The other half, thick envelopes with no return address. Clippings of my face from newspapers, my eyes marked with crude black XS. One contained nothing but a single bullet, taped to a blank sheet of paper. I'd been in the justice system long enough to know this wasn't about Halston alone. He had allies, men who owed him favors, men who now blamed me for breaking the chain that kept them untouchable. The first to make a move was Councilman Wexler. At the next city budget meeting, he raised a motion to review judicial spending and reassess compensation for court-appointed staff. It was a paper-thin excuse to starve my court of resources. It didn't stop there. My calendar began to fill with cases reassigned at the last minute, cases involving officers who had served under Halston. In each one, the defense lawyers arrived with a new air of defiance, as if daring me to rule against them. But the part that cut deepest came one evening when I stopped at the grocery store. In the frozen foods aisle, I ran into Officer Lena Brooks, the same one who had told me the tide was turning. Her smile was small, strained. "They moved me to desk duty," she said quietly. "Said it was for my safety. But we both know what it is: retaliation, punishment for loyalty to the truth." That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the neat stack of case files I had brought home. The law had done its job in the courtroom, but outside, the rules were different. I had two choices: let the pressure wear me down, or double down myself, and I knew exactly which one I would choose. You can't stand alone forever. Even the strongest wall needs pillars. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening. I was still in my chambers, reviewing motions, when my clerk stepped in and said, "There's someone here to see you. He says it's urgent." The man who walked in wore a dark suit that had seen better days, and a badge clipped to his belt, not a police badge, but the gold shield of the state attorney's office. "Judge," he said, shaking my hand firmly, "name's Marcus Tillman. I've been following your situation." I recognized the name. Tillman was known for two things: winning cases everyone thought were unwinnable, and making enemies in high places while doing it. We talked for an hour, the rain tapping against the tall windows like impatient fingers. "I've been building something," Tillman said finally. "A task group, informal for now, but tight. Investigators, auditors, a few officers who aren't afraid to risk their pensions. We've all had run-ins with Halston's circle. We know it goes deeper than him." I leaned back, weighing his words. If you're looking for me to spearhead this, I'm looking for you to stand with us, he interrupted. Publicly, when the time comes. Until then, all I need is information, patterns, cases, anything that ties the same names together. That night, I went home and pulled the oldest case files from my shelf, the ones that had kept me up long after the trials ended. Different defendants. Different charges. But the same officers appearing in the reports. The same contractors filing inflated invoices. The same city officials pushing certain cases through with unnatural speed. I started making calls. Former prosecutors. Defense attorneys I trusted. Even a retired judge who'd once warned me, this city's problems don't start in the courtroom. They start at the dinner tables where the deals are made. Within weeks, we had a network. A quiet one. Meetings in diners and backrooms, encrypted messages passed through secure apps. We mapped connections like a spider's web, each line revealing how far Halston's influence had spread and who had stepped in to fill the void he left. Then came the first real strike. A low-level procurement officer, arrested for embezzlement, agreed to talk in exchange for leniency. He named names. One of them sat on the city council. Another ran a non-profit that funneled seized property into private hands. It was proof not enough to take to court yet, but enough to rattle the foundation. Of course, word got around. Anonymous warnings started appearing again. My tires were slashed in the courthouse parking lot. An unmarked envelope with a grainy photo of my house showed up on my desk. But now, I wasn't alone. Tillman's people shadowed me when I left the courthouse. Lena Brooks quietly slipped me updates from inside the department. Even Judge Morales, my old mentor, agreed to act as a public shield if things got ugly. We weren't just defending anymore. We were moving forward, and everyone who had counted on my silence was beginning to realize it. When the wall finally falls, you realize it was hollow all along. It began with a single warrant, one signature, one order authorizing the search of a storage unit on the edge of town rented under a fake name, paid in cash. Tillman's team found boxes stacked to the ceiling. Inside, financial ledgers, burner phones, and a trail of documents linking city contracts, police overtime, and seized asset sales to a network of shell companies. Every signature, every approval, traced back to names we'd been circling for months. By the time the sun rose, there were half a dozen raids in motion across the city. Councilman Wexler's office, the home of a former deputy chief, the warehouse of a non-profit that supposedly provided resources to underprivileged youth, but in reality, sold confiscated goods for profit. The press was everywhere. Helicopters thumped overhead. News vans blocked intersections. For the first time, the public saw the web for what it was, not just a few bad actors, but an entire system feeding on itself. Halston himself was brought back into the spotlight. Already stripped of his badge, he now faced fresh charges: money laundering, conspiracy, abuse of authority. I wasn't part of the raids. My role came later. The hearings. The arraignments. The process of turning evidence into rulings that would hold up on appeal. The courthouse was a pressure cooker. Defense attorneys scrambled, deals were cut, and one by one, the pillars of Halston's old empire began to crumble. The day Wexler stood before me was the day I felt the full weight of it. He tried charm first, all smooth smiles and respectful tones. Then indignation, painting himself as a victim of political revenge. But the evidence was relentless. Contract kickbacks. Fraudulent invoices. Bank accounts fattened by taxpayer money. When I read the sentence aloud, his eyes hardened. "You think this changes anything?" he said. "There will always be another me." I met his gaze. "Then there will always be another me, too." By the end of that month, 15 officials had been indicted. Several officers resigned rather than face investigation. City contracts were frozen, reviewed, and in many cases, dissolved. The air felt different. Not cleaner, corruption doesn't vanish overnight, but lighter, as if the city itself had exhaled for the first time in years. On my last day hearing cases before a short recess, I left the bench and stepped into the hall. The same families who had once stood on the courthouse steps holding photographs were there again. Only this time, they weren't pleading for justice. They were thanking me for it. That night, I sat alone in my kitchen, a single lamp casting shadows across the table. I thought of every risk, every late-night threat, every person who had told me to step aside. Justice had been done, but more importantly, it had been seen. And sometimes, that's what keeps the next fight possible.